Chapter 3 concerns the self. It will define the self as basically three components to the self, and it will elaborate on that definition to discuss how the self works within society. The self may seem like an odd concept to discuss in social psychology, since the self kind of implies aloneness, being alone, just the self. But in fact, social psychologists generally agree that the self is at its core a social phenomenon, that indeed, without being embedded in a society, an individual may have no particular self concept or self knowledge. The learning objectives for this chapter are to explain the importance of a complex self in a cultural animal, to summarize the different sources and knowledge and motives of self-knowledge, to describe how the sources of self-knowledge lead to self-concepts. We'll discuss and analyze the benefits and drawbacks of high self-esteem and positive illusions, and we'll evaluate the different functions of self-presentation, or how one presents himself to others. So what is the self? It's difficult to define for much of human history, certainly at least as far back as the Greek philosophers in ancient Greece. Efforts have been made to understand what the self is and to define it. The sciences, particularly the psychological sciences, are our latest attempt to really understand in detail what exactly is the self. And as we come to understand what the self is, we can hope to better self-actualize. That is, we can hope as individuals to be truer to ourselves, to become the selves that we aspire to be. So it is difficult to define. Some say it's so difficult to define that it's probably an illusion. One reason some individuals believe that the self is an illusion is because it's difficult to find any particular spot in the brain that corresponds to the self. But like most interesting psychological functions, there probably is no single region in the brain where the self resides. Instead, the self is probably an emergent property that arises out of the interaction of multiple brain regions. So nonetheless, multiple brain regions have been associated with self, and those include regions in an area called the default mode network. The default mode network, again, refers to a set of brain regions that seem to be activated by default. What do we mean activated by default? Well, think of those times when you might be, say, sitting in the doctor's office, waiting for the doctor. It's been 30 minutes and no sign, and you've read all the magazines that are on the coffee table, and you're basically getting bored and have nothing else to do. In those instances, one tends to reflect on oneself. One tends to think about, well, what am I going to have for dinner tonight? Do I need to stop by the grocery store to get some food? Maybe I start to think about studying for the test after dinner that I've got tomorrow. And I think, boy, I really better study hard for this one because I think back to the past and the last time I took a test and maybe I didn't do so well. And I'm determined to do better the next time. So these are the kind of thoughts one tends to default to when they're not involved in any particular task. Now, when you're taking the test in question, you're probably not engaging the default mode network because you're focused on the test itself. Unless perhaps the test is so easy that you don't even have to think about it, then you might engage in that default mode network, like, oh, this is boring, I'm just going to get this test done with quickly. So you have these thoughts about yourself, or perhaps the test is so difficult that you're stressing out. I didn't study well enough for this. I'm going to get a poor grade, and my grade in the class is going to be awful. So by default, we go into these self-reflective modes, and outside of default times, we're engaged in specific tasks. And when you're engaged in a task that you have enough resources to do well, so that it's not stressful for you, but also that it's difficult enough that you're not bored with it, In those instances, when we're engaged in those kind of tasks, the default network is shut off. Default here merely means that this network turns on when you're not engaged in a task by default. So what are some of the brain regions associated with this? This will be the first time you've probably heard of these brain regions unless you've taken a neuroscience class already, but don't let that intimidate you. One region is the medial prefrontal cortex, another the medial parietal, the lateral parietal cortex, and finally the hippocampus. These are the four brain regions that are contemporarily thought to make up the default mode network. And the way these regions were discovered to be involved with the default mode network was effectively by having participants lie in a scanner and do nothing. Of course, the human brain is never doing nothing, so that when you're lying in a scanner with nothing to do, you're probably going to engage that default network. You're probably going to think about what you're going to have for dinner, when you're going to study for the next test because the last test you did poorly on, etc. So let's see where these regions are in the brain. Here we see the image of a brain that is actually inflated. So if you're used to looking at images of the brain, then this image probably looks rather awkward to you. It's got a few folds in it, but not nearly the number of folds that you typically see in a brain. And the reason that this brain has been inflated is to bring those folds, the crevices or the valleys of those folds up to the surface so that we can see every region of the brain. If it were folded up, then those valleys, or sulci as they're referred to, we would not be able to see those from the surface. So don't let the fact that this brain looks awkward relative to what you may have seen before, don't let that disturb you too much. So let's first go to the medial portion of the brain. This is in the middle. You recall that the brain has two hemispheres. So if we kind of separate those hemispheres and look in at the middle portions of the left and right hemisphere, then what we're going to find is medial prefrontal cortex up here toward the front of the brain. Toward the back of the brain, we're going to find medial parietal as well as posterior cingulate cortex. Now, just to let you know, I typically just refer to the medial parietal, not bothering to point out the posterior cingulate. So if you hear me say medial parietal, I'm really referring to the posterior cingulate as well. Okay? So medial prefrontal cortex and medial parietal cortex were the two brain regions that were first discovered to be part of this default network. And that discovery happened in the late 80s. Since the late 80s, as further research has been done into the default network and the brain regions associated with it, the lateral inferior parietal cortex has been added to it. So here we are looking not at the medial portion of the brain, but the outside portion of the brain, the lateral region. So this lateral inferior parietal region appears to come on by default when you have nothing else to do. And also this region back here in the medial portion, down in the temporal lobes, called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is one of the better known regions of the brain. It's extremely important for memory. How is that important for the default network? Well, recall, as I said, one of the things you do in the default network is think back to the past. Again, for example, such as thinking, oh, the last time I took a test in this class, I didn't do well, I didn't study for it. And so the hippocampus is involved in retrieving those memories. And interestingly, it's not only involved in retrieving the memories of the past, but it's also involved in thinking about the future. Thinking, well, I did so poorly in the past. This time in the future, I'm going to make sure I study harder so that I'm prepared for this test that's upcoming. As we mentioned, this default mode network is a function of self-reflection, but we also mentioned that the self is inherently social. So it's not surprising that we'll see on this slide that not only is the default mode network involved in self-processing, but it's also involved in things that we think of as more broadly social. So in this first part of this image, we see the default mode network activated for autobiographical memory. Again, we see the medial prefrontal cortex, we see the medial parietal, we see the hippocampus down here is activated, and we see the lateral inferior parietal cortex. Those four main regions of the default mode network are all active when we retrieve memories of the self, when we retrieve autobiographical memories. As I mentioned in the last slide also, this same network is not only involved in thinking about your past, but also trying to imagine your future. Again, medial prefrontal, medial parietal, the hippocampus, and the lateral inferior parietal. So those are the brain regions that are active when you think about your own mind, your own thoughts. But what about when you think about other people's thoughts? Well, interestingly enough, the same brain regions activate: medial prefrontal, medial parietal. We don't actually see the hippocampus in this instance, but we do see the lateral inferior parietal. So why should these brain regions light up when you're thinking about other people's thoughts? Well, these brain data suggest that thinking about other people's thoughts involves the same brain regions as thinking about your own thoughts. That the way you understand your own beliefs, that's the same way that you come to understand other people's beliefs. And this is often referred to as theory of mind. This is kind of an odd terminology, but it refers to the idea that we all have a theory that each of us has a mind. I have a theory that you, the students, have minds. Otherwise, I wouldn't bother recording a lecture for you. And you wouldn't bother listening to my lecture if you didn't have the theory or the belief that I have a mind. So not only does the default network help us understand our own minds, it also helps us understand other people's minds. And then even in the case of moral decision making, we see that default network, the medial prefrontal, the medial parietal, maybe the hippocampus. This is a kind of a scattered set of brain regions, but also that lateral inferior parietal region. So why should your default mode network be activated during moral decision making? Why should self-reflection be involved in moral decision making? Well, your morals are part of your self-identity, so that when you're trying to make a moral decision, you are thinking about yourself. In fact, if you think about mob mentality, in those cases where mobs have formed in the past and done things of an atrocious level that they may not have done otherwise, so mobs that have summarily executed people, you may frankly even consider the mob that stormed the U.S. Capitol in January of 2021. There were some deaths involved, and police were beaten, and the members of these mobs did some fairly atrocious actions that they perhaps never would have considered doing if they had not been part of that mob. Why? Because being part of a mob distracts the individual from themselves. If you're caught up in a mob, you are thinking about what everybody else in the mob is thinking about, like storming the Capitol and stopping the certification of the free and fair elections. Since you are thinking about what the mob is thinking about and not thinking about yourself, then your decisions tend to not reflect your own morals. In order to behave consistent with your own morals, you have to be very self-aware. When you're in the middle of a mob, you're very much not self-aware. Therefore, the decisions you make are unlikely to reflect. Having taken a look at some of the social neuroscience about the self, let's define it a little more specifically. The self's main job has been designed to enable you to relate to others, and it helps you resolve conflicts between selfishness and social conscience. That is, it's designed to enable you to relate to others insofar as successful interaction with other people requires some knowledge about the distinction between who you are and who the others around you are. And so it certainly evolved in order to help us with social interaction. And it also helps in terms of this kind of almost Freudian battle between selfish impulses and social conscience. Selfishness is a word I prefer not to use in this context because it implies that it's a bad thing. But of course, you have to be selfish sometimes. The self has to take care of the self. But there are plenty of times that we run into on a daily basis where we could choose either to be more selfish or more socially conscious, or conscious. That should be, actually, I'm just realizing that's the wrong word. Should be social conscious. Well, actually, I guess conscience. makes sense. But anyway, the there are three different aspects of the self, at least as referred to by Baumeister and Bush. There's the self-knowledge or self-concept. Okay, this is a rather cognitive concept in which we have information about the self. We have self-awareness, self-esteem, self-deception. These are all parts of what we consider self-knowledge or the self-concept. There's the interpersonal self, which is a presentation of yourself. It's not the same thing as your self-knowledge or your self-concept because it doesn't necessarily present everything that you know about yourself. When we go out in public, we always present a side of ourselves that does not contain everything, certainly not some of our deepest aspects of self. And there's some things we just choose in public for people to not see, hence this sense of privacy that we have. But interpersonal self is your self-presentation. It's the you that is invoked when you're a member of a group. It can be invoked with relationship partners. It is aware and conceiving of your social roles and your reputation. And then the third and final kind of self or aspect of self is the agent self. And this one refers to the things you do, decision making, your self-control, taking charge of situations, active responding, this sort of thing. And it may well be that the agent self is what is particularly impaired in schizophrenia. Some theories of schizophrenia suggest that the difficulties that some people have in schizophrenia is not being aware of their own actions. Okay, that agent self is somehow impaired. And we'll discuss agent self in the next chapter. For this chapter, we're going to focus mainly on self-concept and the interpersonal self. As pointed out earlier, it's unlikely that the self resides in some specific region of the brain. In fact, the self may not even reside in any part of the brain. The self may instead be an emergent property that occurs when the brain interacts with society. The idea here is that an individual not embedded in a society likely would not have much, if any, of a sense of self. As pointed out in your textbook, if you lived alone on a desert island, then you would have no need for a name. You would not have personal beliefs, per se, because there would be no one else with whom you could contrast those beliefs. You might have some sense of a body that belongs to a you or to a self, but it would not be a very elaborate sense of self. The sense of self really seems to depend on a brain inside of a person interacting with a society. This brings up the question of a true self. And it's not clear that there's a such thing as a true self, at least not in the sense of inner feelings versus the way a person acts in public. Some cultures seem to think that the inner self, one's inner feelings, are the true self, and that the way a person acts in public is not the true self. On the other hand, some cultures seem to believe that that outer self, or the self that we see in public, is the true self, despite whatever inner feelings may exist inside. Now we'll consider the idea of self-construal. This is really effectively the same thing as self-concept, just representing that annoying tendency scientists have of using different words to refer to the same concept. So again, self-construal can be regarded as similar to self-concept. And within self-construal research, the idea is that there are two ways one can construe or kind of conceive of the self. And that can be as independent, such as we often see in Western cultures, particularly in the United States. The other way of construing the self is as interdependent, such as is seen more commonly in Eastern Asian cultures and so forth. So if we look over on the right, we see kind of a graphic depiction of those types of self-construal, independent versus interdependent. Now, the independent, as we see more in Western civilizations, has the self here represented in orange, and then has relationships represented by these yellow circles: mothers, friends, co-workers, siblings, father, etc. And the idea is that one can conceive of mother, father, siblings, etc. as perhaps being close to the self, but not intruding on the boundaries of the self. Whereas in more collectivistic, interdependent cultures, these mother, father, sibling roles tend to actually invade the self, tend to actually be more a part of the self. So what do we mean by that? Well, one example your textbook points out is the way Western versus Eastern cultures might construe an individual such as Shun Fujimoto in the 1976 Olympics, who, despite having a broken knee, nonetheless completed his gymnastics routine, and I believe won the gold medal for that. It's quite a heroic example of an athlete. The difference between an independent construal of Shun versus an interdependent construal would be that Westerners are more likely to think of Fujimoto as having persevered on his own, as having the strong desire to win the medal for himself and fought through the pain. On the other hand, more Eastern cultures would likely construe an interdependent sense of self for Fujimoto, saying that more than doing it for himself and for the glory of having won the gold, he did it for the team. He didn't want to let his teammates down. That if he weren't so concerned about his teammates, he may not have bothered to have fought through the pain. So we can see those are two very different ways of construing the self. Another study that I find quite fascinating. This is a great example of how social psychology experiments sometimes are so incredibly simple, yet so powerful in the implications that can be derived from the studies. So in this particular study, a researcher would take a handful of pens, say 10 pens, and 9 of those pens would be black, and 1 of them would be red, just representing the different ink colors. And they would randomly walk up to a person of either European American descent or Asian American descent, and they would just ask each person they approached to just simply take a pen for free. Pick any pen you want. And most European Americans chose the red pen. They chose the pen that was different from all the others, whereas Asian Americans were much more likely to pick one of the black pens, the pens that were like most of the group. And this may sound kind of unrelated to independent versus interdependent construal of self, but in fact, it almost certainly grows up out of those construals. The typical European American really values independence, and so having a pen color that is different than all the others is a form of independence, whereas choosing a pen color that is like most of the other pens is a function of one's interdependence, one's desire to fit in with the group as opposed to be an individual independent of that group. So we can also think of this as individualism versus collectivism, which we had mentioned previously in the lectures, and seems to be an important difference between various kinds of self-construal. Another important aspect of self-construal refers to our social roles. Clearly, the average human has many social roles, ranging from child to parent to police officer to professor to friend. Many different roles one holds within society. And those roles are often invoked when one is asked to identify who they are. Who am I? Oh, I'm a professor who has a wife. I have 2 kids. Notice that each of those statements about who I am really refers to roles that I play within society. Social systems create and define these roles, and individuals seek and adopt them. And it is this way that we develop our sense of self, or at least in part how we develop our sense of self. As noted in the textbook, it's interesting to notice that other species of animals have social roles, such as ants that have the queen ant and the worker ants, the soldier ants. But what's interesting about those individuals within those societies, if you will, they don't change their roles. If you're a worker ant, you are a worker ant, and that's it. You don't come to be a soldier, or certainly not the queen. You are in the role that is kind of defined for you either by the society or ants, or maybe more by the biology of the ants. But when you get to humans, you see that humans play many different roles at any given moment in their lives, and across their lifespan will often change roles. Say changing jobs, becoming a parent when you weren't one before, becoming a spouse if you weren't one before, etc. Now that we've discussed self-concepts, self-construal, independent versus interdependent self, let's talk about self-awareness, which is related to self-construal or self-concept, but at the same time has some differences. So what is self-awareness? Well, this is attention directed at the self. As you know, you can pay attention to things you're looking at. You can pay attention to one thing you're looking at to the exclusion of another. You can pay attention to what you're hearing, to what you're smelling, to what you're feeling, etc. Well, one of the things you can do is feel the self. Remember, the self is not just simply in a particular brain region, not even particularly in the brain itself. So the self is dependent not just on the brain, but also on how the body feels. When somebody asks you, how do you feel about something? Well, you literally feel your own body and you give an answer. Say, well, I myself feel this way or that way. So self-awareness involves, in a large part, feeling your body. It involves directing yourself toward those feelings and the kinds of thoughts that those feelings generate inside of you. There are 2 kinds of self-awareness: private self-awareness and public self-awareness. If we think about private self-awareness, we think of looking inward at aspects of the self. And so this private self-awareness often tends to be evaluative. So we have the word evaluation here, and you see it. You may not be used to looking at the brain this way, but this is another section where we're looking at the right hemisphere of the brain, and we're looking at the middle portion or the medial portion of it. If you've heard of the corpus callosum, the structure that connects the 2 hemispheres, corpus callosum, that's this structure right here. We could use that as a landmark, and we could say the front of the brain is up here toward these yellow, blue, and red regions, whereas the back of the brain is back here toward these green regions. Okay? And recall that with the default mode network, we discussed the front region, the medial prefrontal, as we can see with DMPFC, dorsomedial prefrontal, or OMPFC, orbital medial prefrontal. We have the medial prefrontal region, and back behind it we have that posterior parietal / posterior cingulate, okay, or medial parietal, actually we usually say, and posterior cingulate. Now, again, with private self-awareness, that tends to be evaluative, and there's evidence that the neurons in the brain that are doing self-evaluation appear to be clustered around this yellow medial prefrontal region. We can see the blue region appears to be related to monitoring. So you evaluate yourself with one region, it looks like, and you monitor yourself with another region. So private self-awareness is likely dependent largely on this medial prefrontal region, whereas the posterior cingulate and the medial parietal region of that default mode network, they seem to be more involved in integration. And one form of integration is integration with others, kind of a social integration. And that would presumably be related more to this public self-awareness. How do I take the awareness of myself and integrate it with the public, with people around me? So private self-awareness